Welcome to the Real Autism Podcast. Real as in relevant, effective, actionable living strategies and solutions for a better quality of life. Join your host, Alicia Gaucher Page, for some real conversations. Sponsored by J. Cole Autism Coaching.
All right. So welcome to the Real Autism Podcast, where we're talking about relevant, effective, actionable living strategies and solutions. I am happy today to be with Miss Rachel Barron, who is my guest. I think she's going to share some great information, and I just want to go ahead and jump in. Welcome, Rachel, to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me, Alicia. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Awesome. So let's start out. Just tell us a little bit about you, as who you are. Who is Rachel?
So, wow. So I always start with I'm a mom of 3 boys, right? And that's almost like the punchline that I start with ahead of time, right? So my boys are grown. They've all been affected by neurodiversity in some way, either by ADHD or even cerebral palsy. One of my boys has CP. And it really has shaped my professional career and what I'm kind of the advocacy work that I've done personally. And I think the benefit of that, or what I would say the blessing of it, is how can we create whole lives for people who experience neurodiversity? I'm married to a very patient man named David and have been for almost 30 years. And I'm also the founder of Effective Students, and we're an academic coaching and executive functioning instructional practice, and we've been around for 10 years.
I was muted. I'm sorry. So what brought on Effective Students? Like, what brought on, was it your personal experience that you had or professional experience? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was actually both. So I had worked as an educational advocate for about 6.5 years. And what I have found in our practice is that nobody was really teaching executive function skills aligned with good special education practices. And so I took parts of ABA and errorless teaching and faded support to independence, and I started working with my own kids who were struggling with ADHD. And because I had to create those practices so that they could actually begin learning the skills to manage themselves and their resources for school and manage their responsibilities. And so over time, I started working with more students because I felt like there was a easier way to train kids to become independent, right? Through some processes. Just think about us in a business model. We depend on processes to get things done, right? Well, nobody was really teaching kids reliable processes to make the job of being a student easier. So I started trying all this stuff out on my own kids, who are my guinea pigs, and it started to work. And then I started working with more students. And then ultimately I created a curriculum and a set of processes that we train teachers and students that we work with in classes and one-on-one coaching. So that's kind of how we got started in Effective Students. I did not get here alone by any stretch of the imagination. I've partnered with some incredible educators along the way, some of whom work at area private schools who experience the same thing from the teacher's perspective, right? And then how do we impact students' learning and skill set for teachers to be able to deliver content so the kids can actually learn the material? So I was trying to marry that intent of how do we get access, if we think about that, not building access, but learning access for those kids who struggle with executive functions.
That's awesome. And I'm pretty sure, there have been some common challenges for students, particularly with ADHD and ASD in terms of managing academics. How has the executive function coaching addressed those challenges?
Yeah, so we try and start simple and go to a more sophisticated platform, right? We don't want to overwhelm kids. So we start with simple things like how do you organize yourself, right? Both in the concrete and the abstract, right? How do we teach a process of that really by building awareness in kids, right? And then moving them to systems that they can help co-create, but then be diligent enough to follow through. So we actually serve a lot of kids with ASD, actually.
Okay.
We have found that's more and more common, particularly as these kids end up matriculating from high school, and are in the process of building a full life. Executive functions skills impact their self-care, their ability to get out of the house timely, their ability to keep track of their materials and affairs, their ability to think flexibly and adjust to changes. So we're working on all of those skills to help them learn how to adapt in a new environment.
Would you say that executive functioning is more effective with what we deem as high functioning individuals, or can you also leverage it for those that need a little bit more support?
I think you can always leverage it for people who need more support, right?
Okay.
I mean, the goal, and it's really how do we scaffold the instruction back to a place where it's relevant for the individual learning, right? And so executive function skills impact 2E kids, right? When I talk about twice exceptional students, really gifted kids who just look like smart but scattered, right?
Right.
We've all heard that by Peg Dawson. And so that book, but it also really impacts kids' motor planning, language planning, decision making, task initiation, right? So if you think about how that may impact someone who has difficulty getting started, right? That might be somebody on the spectrum, but it also might be somebody with motor apraxia like CP, right?
Right.
So it all really impacts them. And think about executive functions as growing and being developed between the ages of 13 and 25.
Mhm. Okay.
That's in the typical space, right? Now you want to layer ADHD on top of that. Those kids' EF skills develop about 2 years behind, right? And then think about someone who has more impacted with ASD or CP, right? Doesn't mean they can't learn it. It just means
Right.
more repetition. You think about frequency, intensity, and duration of instruction. I don't think it differs for them at all.
And you bring up a good point, like that age range. You mentioned the 13, I forgot the end age that you provided, but that is an ideal time in terms of transitioning or transitional planning and services.
Right.
So I think executive functioning, now that, because to be honest with you, Rachel, I was like, what is executive functioning? Like, what does that really mean? And
Right.
then I started doing a little bit more research about it. I was like, wow, I mean, that's essentially the service that I provide for my executives at work. And it's also what I share with other caregivers in terms of just kind of being organized and having to manage this journey, this new journey to them. So it really makes a difference, not just in the lives of the individual that may have the condition, but also with the caregiver as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, completely. I mean, I don't know if you all are like this, but I learn by making mistakes, right? We
Yeah.
learn more from mistakes than we do from successes. And so I definitely think sometimes in our business, we call it apple tree problems, right? That apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? So the caregivers have to have a degree of executive function skills to manage the paperwork, the advocacy, the agency, the person's care, their own care, right? I mean, like it's overwhelming how taxing it is as a parent of a person with a disability. But, I mean, you add 1 or 2 more kids on that and you're playing a bad zone defense and it's rough, right? And so I learned that I had a time management problem when I kept leaving my kids around town. And I tell this story honestly because, I mean, my kids laugh about it now because they're older, but literally I left my youngest child at preschool an hour and a half. I left him at summer camp an extra day because I had the wrong pickup time. I left him at a sports camp. I left him at the MARTA one time. He had to walk home. I mean, I was constantly distracted and had too much on my plate. What was I missing? Balancing my time and tasks, taking time to plan ahead, and I wasn't communicating. So those are all executive function skills, right?
Definitely.
So I definitely think that if the parents don't have those skills innately or they're struggling, getting help for that is really important because you want to alleviate the stress, and we as adults can learn too. So there's no reason not to get the support.
Exactly. And you brought up the term, which is great transition, about advocacy. So how do you define advocacy in the context of the work that you do, and why is it important for individuals with ADHD and ASD?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So before I started Effective Students, I was a professional advocate, right? And that really was born out of my belief that my kids could do more, right? So it was very highly personal to me. And then finding ways for neurodiverse individuals to learn was fun. Like I thought it was fun and a challenge. Fast forward to kind of where we are now, and the more I've learned about ADHD, people with ADHD get more negative input than they get positive input by an exponential amount. I would say for every 10 comments, 8 are corrections or redirections versus 2 positives, right?
Right.
So there's a conversation in the ADHD community about rejection dysphoria. And I'm sure it applies to kids with ASD just as well, and adults. So I did a training on ADHD and its prevalence, and I had a bunch of educators brainstorm. When I say the word ADHD, what comes to mind? And they threw out a bunch of adjectives and descriptors and everything. Yeah, 80% of them were not positive. Now, later on in the presentation, I talked about rejection dysphoria and how many negative messages that they get. And then all of a sudden, the room was really quiet. And I said, okay, now that we all feel terrible about our preconceived notions, let's talk about what are the awesome things that people with ADHD can do. And so I don't know if you ever watched the show Peaky Blinders, but, they would all, it was like sort of the Irish mob, and they would walk out. And it's sort of when you have a problem, you called all the people with ADHD because they're really creative at coming up with solutions. So it's the two sides of the same coin, right? It's just which one you want to choose to look at. And I think the same thing is true with ASD. People with ASD can do a lot of very amazing things, but just like all of us, they have strengths and weaknesses. Theirs just may be more pronounced, right?
Definitely. Totally agree. I actually just did a post the other day on social media about, have you ever looked at someone and said, I think they are autistic? And I was like, what made you say that? And my point of that post was to say there are a lot of unconscious bias, and a lot of times autism defines the deficits of a person, but it really does not define who the person really is. So I feel like, we're saying the same thing. Let's step away from the negative inputs that come along with people's preconceived notion about what it is, and focus more on a person's potential, not their struggles, their strengths, not their deficits.
Exactly.
So that's a very valid point. Can you explain, because I've seen this term thrown around as well, just in me filling out paperwork for my 2 autistic kids, I've seen the term person-centered planning. So can you explain the concept of person-centered planning and how it influences the services that you offer?
Yes. And I feel very strongly about person-centered planning, because if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person, right? And so it's really important, if you think about us as, what people will call neurotypical, we typically get to choose our pathway in life, right? I want to grow up and go to this college. I want to grow up and get that job. I want to marry that person. I want to live in Atlanta or New York or California, right? So we have this element of self-determination and self-advocacy and agency that we bring to the table, right? So if a person with a disability has difficulty communicating or organizing their thoughts and being able to communicate, it's very easy to say, oh, because you have this disability, you belong. Why? Okay. Or because you have autism, you must be a good widget maker or programmer or, right, all of these things, right? And so it's just putting people in boxes. And so the opposite of that is helping an individual and their family create a full life and that's centered around them and their agenda, right? Okay, so maybe it's a little bit difficult to get the agenda out of them. That doesn't mean it's not worth it. It doesn't mean it's not worth the investment of time and effort. Those people have ideas. They want to know what they want to do, right? And the more we give them a vehicle to communicate, it builds momentum for their desires because they've literally been told what to do for so much of their educational career and where they belong. That now we're like, okay, now what are you going to do? And they're like, what do you mean? What am I going to do? I'm like, we're going to ask you what you want to do, right? And how are we going to tackle this? So it became a very potent point in when we were in a strongly advocating for our son who was in a public school system at the time. And one of the key pieces that was asked is to an expert is, what do you know about person-centered planning? And the answer was a lot of crickets.
Just like now, it was dead silent.
Right now, right? And I thought that, how do we have experts in the world of people with disabilities who are not embracing the concept of person-centered planning? So that's kind of my 2 cents on that one, Alicia.
Awesome. And then another term that also comes to mind that I would love to hear your input on is presumed competence.
Good gracious. Okay. This, I could tell you stories that would just make everybody's head spin.
Tell us the story that'll make our heads spin. People don't believe it. So
okay,
tell us the real deal.
Okay. So, when you have 3 kids and you're playing bad zone defense, you're traveling light. Never, right? So I'm dragging them around town, and my oldest has an appointment with a geneticist, right? And they wanted to do all this genetic testing and understand everything, right? So we go into this appointment, and mind you, my oldest with CP is the oldest, right? And then his two younger siblings ended up having ADHD and dyslexia. They're bouncing all over the walls. Okay, you can just imagine having these 3 boys in there. And the geneticist says, in front of my oldest and my other kids, he has no language, talking about my oldest. Mm-hmm. And my other 2 boys go, what are you talking about? I mean, they were 8 and 6 or 5, right? And I was like, oh, these are much older.
He's riled them up.
They go, what are you talking about? He has language. He doesn't have speech. And the geneticist looked right at them, and my boys literally were like, what are you talking about? They could communicate at that age when they were very young because they lived with their brother. They saw him respond. They listened to me communicate with him. So we presumed that he knew what we were talking about, right? And that made a huge difference in us seeing him. Right? I'm going to presume that you were there, and I'm going to expect you to do the best you can, regardless if you have a disability or you have brown hair and blue eyes or whatever, right? You have to do the very best that you're able to do. I have actually approached other kids with a disability when we worked and ran the buddy baseball program for years. And one young man in particular, he would exhibit some behaviors, right? We all have behaviors. They're a form of, control or whatever. And I looked at him and I was like, knock it off. And he was astounded that he was held accountable because I presumed that he was competent, and he was mortified. And to this day, he sees me coming and he's like, no way. Because I know you're there. I know you can see it. And I also know you know better. So it's a big respect issue. It's actually, to me, the way we show our children respect, and that teach them to respect themselves.
I mean, I think that is a jewel that you just dropped, because so many times people presume incompetence instead of competence. And I think with the presumed competence concept, it allows us to build a more inclusive environment, because while we are going to be considerate, right, of a person's conditions and where it may create some constraints, that doesn't necessarily mean we treat them any different. And I think, now I can use a more educated term, because even for me, when I'm dealing with my children and how I talk to them, quote unquote, like they're regular. And people are like, wow, Alicia, you're, how do you know they understand? Trust me, they understand. I mean, even if I walk in a room and they are testing out a caregiver and how much they can push their limits, and when I walk in, it's like that means they understand the difference, because if they didn't, they would act the same with me as they would with anybody else. So I think that's a great point, and not only for outsiders looking in, but even as a parent. Sometimes I think because we were the hover parents, we don't really allow our kids sometimes to demonstrate what they really can do. We make that decision for them. So that's definitely good advice there.
One of the most powerful things is to just say, get out of the way. Don't be so hasty. And I'm such a, historically been so impatient. Now I'm like, create that distance, create that space, let them have to close the space. I'll tell you another funny story. So we are churchgoers, and we belong to this church, and we don't go there anymore, but just kind of that concept of assumptions and people presuming things. So the way up to the front of the altar was sloped, right? It was like on a grade. And our oldest, would kind of get a little momentum going, and he loved to be around all these people. And I did not want to be down there because it was super crowded. So he walked down there. So then I just sort of left him there and just watched him wander around. And then people started looking around to see who he belonged to, because literally people thought that he had been abandoned there. They were all worried. So I was probably not very nice, but I just sat back and watched for a bit. And then apparently somebody came and knew him and said, come on over. So, people can assume lots of different things, but he understands absolutely everything. Right. And he'll decide, just like a person with autism, whether they want to show their intelligence or make the effort. And if they're respected, they're much more apt to make the effort to engage.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Do you have, since you're on the line of sharing stories, can you share a success story where advocacy and person-centered planning significantly impacted a student's path or what their future would look like?
Well, I would say definitely with my son, for sure, but I would say, advocacy, we've had kids who when I was an advocate, were asked to leave public school because of their impulsivity, right? Ended up at a private school and did really, really well, right? Not every environment is for every kid. We've also worked with kids who left private school and had to go into public school and done really, really well too. So I would say advocacy and improvement is a chronic commitment. It's more about consistency, and sometimes you have to lean in really hard, right, and really push. And then there are other times you can just use some gentle pressure, right, to move things along. Just to kind of give you an example, our youngest was told within the first 2 weeks of his life that he wouldn't live past the age of 4.
Wow.
And that he had a neurotube defect. and a genetic defect, which neither of which turned out to be true. He subsequently graduated from high school. He is ambulatory, orientation and mobility, can walk out of the house, let the dog out. Unfortunately, he can let the dog out by himself now. He can, get up and down. He can go up and down stairs. He works for the Atlanta Braves, as in guest services. It's not been easy. It's still not easy at times finding team members who can really see that, but it's been always just set the bar a little bit higher, push, set the bar a little bit higher, push, right? Nobody ever rose to low expectations. I think the biggest takeaway for that is don't get on the bus by yourself, right? You're going to be driving that bus for a while. Be real careful about who you invite on that bus and be real quick to invite them off, right? If they are not aligned with your vision of your person, if they do not believe that person is capable, they don't belong on your bus.
I totally love that. That's like a drop the mic statement right there. Like, in other words, we need people, but we need the right people.
That's
and we
right.
need the people that believe in the vision and can see beyond what they see in front of them, but
Correct.
can see in the future.
Correct.
So I love that.
Yep.
What ways do you, because I know you mentioned earlier that you work with the schools, and you might have mentioned you work with the families as well. Can you expand a little bit more on how you collaborate with families and schools to
Sure.
ensure there's a supportive environment for the students?
Absolutely. So at Effective Students, we work with organizations and people different ways. So first, I think in what we do really, really well, and we've done this from the beginning, is we coach people. Mostly we're coaching kids, but we're actually sometimes coaching parents on interfacing with their kids when they're frustrated or find a new way to communicate with their kids about school, right? Kids have a big cognitive load when they go to school, and even kids with learning differences are really taxed during the day. So their buckets are kind of empty. So helping parents learn to respect that, and also kids to become aware of that so that they can reapply themselves, right? So I think that is an important thing, and teaching them steps to create processes that work for them, and then gradually helping them practice those little at a time to become more and more independent. So that's kind of one of the things that we do. We've also written a curriculum called the Effective Student Curriculum for instructors, where we teach the academic management skills, right? It's very much using the KISS theory, keep it simple. Really saying these are the ways we organize. This is how you plan ahead. This is how you hold yourself accountable. This is how you reflect on your performance to see if you're reaching your goals or you're not reaching your goals, which is part of metacognition, right? But it's broken down into very small steps so that the exercises can compound on one another, so the kids start to adopt and understand and expand their thinking. We do PD for educators and parents around executive functioning skills. We've spoken about ADHD and its impact on learners, and how comorbidity, which is really how these ADHD and ASD and learning differences can all kind of coexist, right? Sometimes you don't, and even like anxiety can exist in there too. So we do professional development for educators. And then we also offer workshops and camps, and we have a new curriculum coming up dealing with social emotional skills. And under executive function, what are emotions, and how do we go through learning about ourselves and our emotions and choosing different directions and how to respond.
Awesome. That's great. So how do you identify like who your clients are? Do they come to you, or how do you seek out the people that need this service?
So we've been in Atlanta for quite some time, and now we have an offices in Charlotte, and we've actually gone and done some work in Louisville. And some of it's social media, but a lot of it is people find our website and they schedule a call and say like, hey, I have a kid with ADHD who's experiencing, and they'll sort of explain what's happening. And is this something that you work with? And we're able to say pretty quickly, yeah, we're good about that, or I think maybe your kid's not ready for us yet. Or maybe coaching is appropriate, but you might need a specific type of coach, because we serve families and students really from second grade all the way to adulthood. Like, we've actually worked with clients who have traumatic brain injuries, and their prefrontal cortex, which is where the executive functioning actually occurs, has been really impacted, right? So we're helping retrain those people to go back to work, right? But by and large, we're really working on social emotional skills and regulation in the up through sixth grade. And then starting in fifth grade, fourth grade, we're really working on the academic management skills, right, to help matriculate them. And we'll sort of pair coaches with students who have skill sets that are specific to that family's need.
Awesome. And what does a typical session look like? Like, how long is it? And describe what a session would look like with a coach.
Great question. So it's about an hour. It depends on what the student's goals are and the individual's goals are that are being coached. But let's just take, for one example, a middle schooler in seventh grade who cannot keep track of his or her assignments and their papers, and they've got a ton of missing work, right? So we might teach them a small lesson for about 10, 15 minutes and then help them implement that lesson. Maybe it's organizing their binder in a very specific way. Maybe it's walking them through an exercise where they take a look at how they spend their time during the week and see what that teaches them about where they commit their time. And then we teach them exercises about planning ahead. Once we kind of get those underway, we're really working on study skills, right? We find that kids are by and large are not taught how to study. I was not taught how to study. I didn't learn until I went to college because I had a setback. And so we really teach them, how do you get information into your brain? How do you practice getting information out of your brain? And we put them through a set of paces in the lesson so that they actually know how to do this to prepare for an assessment. And then they come back and they tell us how it went. And sometimes they did great. Sometimes they did okay. And sometimes it didn't work. Right. And we say, that's okay. That's what we're learning, right? We're learning to sample this. So it's very important that we teach them how to respond to setbacks. That's called a growth mindset. We want to build resilience, right? It's not if you have a setback, it's when you do and how you respond to it. So a lot of kids get overwhelmed emotionally when that happens. And I'm like, oh, you want to talk setbacks? I got lots of setbacks for you. Try leaving your kids around town, could be worse. So that usually brings out a chuckle. So we want to be relatable.
Right.
Nobody wants to work with someone who's perfect because none of us are perfect. And so the more relatable we are to the kids and the more fun we make it, the easier it is to do hard things.
That's awesome. What's some of the feedback that you've gotten from the parents after their child has kind of gone through these services? What have they said about it?
They've said things like, it's changed my relationship with my kid around school.
Wow.
That's
major.
That's major, right? I don't nag him anymore. I don't have to, right? It's a big change, right? My kid has learned how to take care of his own business. I'm not worried anymore, right? I worked with one family. I worked with that student for 3 years, intensely for 3 years. And then I didn't work with the student all through high school. He got into his first choice of college. That's a big deal.
That
right?
is a big, not second or third, but first choice.
First choice, right? Because they put in the time. He put it in, and his mom did a really good job of saying, if she told you to do this, then do it, right? I don't want to do it. I don't care you don't want to do it. You're in training. You're in training to be a student. And the kids have, some of it, parents will say, I've been telling them this. I've been telling them this, right? At some point, kids don't want to listen to their parents. But also, sometimes we don't take enough time to put ourselves in the position of the student and explain something to them so that they understand how they would get a benefit by doing something and how it would make their lives better, right? we just have to take the time to talk to them in kid speak about why we do these things.
Right.
So.
That is great news. So as we wrap up the podcast, I want to ask you this final question, because I know a lot of the parents that I meet, they don't necessarily know how to navigate how you advocate for your loved one. So what advice would you give to parents who want to advocate effectively for their neurodiverse children, and not only advocate effectively, but try to be collaborative at the same time?
Right. And so I think one of the most important things is to recognize that teachers didn't go into education not to do right by the kids. Right. So just like we're asking for presumed competence for our students, we also need to presume that teachers care about our children. Right. And I think that's important. So find some common ground. I know you're trying to do the right thing, and you know I'm trying to do the right thing, and somewhere we can meet where we can agree. Right. So understanding that they're human too is important. Parents have a right to have to participate, and to be heard. They have a right to be able to ask why or why not, right? And that can make a big difference. And they can do so politely and respectfully, right? They can have the right to say, where does it say that? We don't do things that way. Well, why not? Right? I thought this was person-centered planning. I thought this was a custom-designed IEP. I thought that's what we were looking for, appropriate for him or her, right? Not just because they fall into a category. So I think that's really good. And be creative. One time I was advocating for a kiddo who was out, I'm not going to tell the county, and this student has autism, and loved to run, like literally loved to run. So I said, he needs to participate in track. And the whole room, there's probably like 15 people in this IEP meeting. They're like, well, he can't do that. Why not? Why can't he do that? Well, what about his safety? I'm like, get a para who runs. And so literally,
we could all use some exercise.
Right. They ended up finding a paraprofessional who loved to run and paired that kid with the para, and he ran, what was it in the fall? Cross country. So you never know, like, just ask why not? Like, wouldn't it be so cool if, and there's a great way to ask that, which is design thinking. I wonder what would happen if we tried it. I wonder what would happen if, and let their creative juices start happening, right? You can always go down the other direction, right? And get more involved, and it can become more contested. But I wonder what would happen if we did this, and how it would open some doors for him and somebody else who might want to help him. Is a great way to enlist people.
You definitely have to have an imagination. Like, you can't go into this with closed off. And even the weirdest thing, like, there's some weird behaviors that, or they appear to be weird behaviors that Jasmine has, but we've transformed them in something that allows her to contribute to society, as well as do something she enjoys. So it goes back to a lot of what I got from this discussion is really the presumed competence, making sure that you think outside the box, don't have unconscious bias about what they can do, and just ask questions. And I feel like to advocate, you might have to ask the same question 3 different ways. Yeah. Because sometimes you might not get the answer, or you might not understand the answer, or they might go off on a tangent and you just have to reset. But this journey that I've been on has definitely taught me patience, and not just patience for dealing with my kids, but also patience for dealing with others to help them understand.
Right. Yes.
The condition.
Honestly. And walking the walk and talking the talk. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and people are watching, right? People watch us, people watch our kids, and people watch the way we interface with them. And our other kids are watching.
So set the example.
That's right.
So Rachel, how do people find you? How do they find effective students?
That's easy. Thank you for asking, Alicia. They can just go to effectivestudents.com and go to whatever page. There's a great navigation. If you're a parent, you can go to that page. If you're a student, you can go to that page. If you're an educator, set up a call. We're happy to help. And I'm just really grateful for Alicia for you having us on here. If you'd have asked me 30 years ago if this would have been my journey, I would have said no way. And now I would never change a thing because it's made my life rich and it's given me the hope to encourage others that there's a lot of great stuff out there.
Well, I definitely appreciate you. I knew when I first met you, we would connect on a lot of different levels. So I look forward to working with you in the future and for us changing the community and just changing the lives of others. So thank you so much for coming on this podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Alicia. Take care.
We'll see you guys next time on the Real Autism Podcast, where we focus on relevant, effective, actionable living strategies and solutions. See ya.
Thank you for tuning in to the Real Autism Podcast with Alicia Gaucher Page. We'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this episode. J. Cole Autism Coaching, helping caregivers navigate to a better quality of life. AGP Organizational Coaching, helping people develop effective strategies, systems, and solutions to organize information. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or just visit us at jcoleadvocacy.com.